It wasn't the crack of thunder that pulled Clara Boone from her sleep, but the eerie hush that settled afterward. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Out in the Arizona territory, storms that fierce didn't just roll on by, they left something broken in their wake. High on Blackwood Ridge, far from the nearest soul in Redemption Creek, Clara knew that whatever had snapped out there was now hers to deal with. She struck a lantern, the flame wobbling and stretching shadows across her one-room cabin. Pulling on Eli Boone's old oilskin coat, the one that still smelled faintly of him, she braced against the gale. The wind howled around the cabin, yet underneath it came another sound, a guttural, strangled moan that wasn't any coyote or steer. It was the sound of a man choking on his own blood. The sky above was ripped apart, bleeding rain across the desert floor. The storm beat her sod roof like war drums, each crash echoing her solitude. For 3 years since Eli's fever had taken him, Clara had lived with loneliness as her closest companion. She knew every mood of this land, the cruel blaze of noon, the sharp bite of midnight chill, but tonight felt different. This storm wanted to tear her life down to splinters. She had been patching a worn harness by candlelight when it came, a crash followed by the panicked scream of her horse Storm. Heart-hammering, she grabbed her Winchester, the rifle never far from reach, and moved toward the door. Through the cracks in the boards, the world was a curtain of silver rain, a nightmare with no edges. Then it came again, that low moan, human and raw, cutting through the storm like a knife. Every instinct screamed at her to bolt the door, snuff the light, and pray it passed. Folks in town whispered that the Apache were stirring again. Ranch hands claimed skirmishes stolen stock, always with that venom in their tone. Trouble was hunting, and a woman alone was a beacon. But then she heard her father's voice steady in her memory. Dr. Cutter had always said, "You don't let a soul bleed out in the dirt, no matter what color his skin is." Cursing under her breath, Clara shoved the latch free and stepped into the storm. The wind clawed at her, plastering her calico dress to her body, nearly snuffing out the lantern. She shielded the flame with her hand boots, sinking into the sucking mud as she followed the sound. She found him near the split section of fence. Long black hair plastered to his skull, buckskin clinging to his frame. A warrior sprawled in the mud, one hand clutching his side, the other reaching for nothing. Blood pooled dark beneath him, washing thin in the rain. Clara's grip tightened on the Winchester. He was lean muscle, trembling in shock, his face carved in pain. A bullet had torn through high on his right side, bad enough it might have pierced a lung. He wasn't one of Vance Mercer's ranch hands. They never left their own to die. This was a renegade the nightmare whispered about in Redemption Creek. Sense told her to leave him to the storm. Dragging him inside was begging for death, whether by his kin or by Mercer's men calling her a traitor. Then his eyes flicked open dark as wet stone fire, burning deep even through the haze. He looked at her, then at the rifle, no fear, no plea, just the quiet resolve of a man ready to die as he had lived a warrior. In that instant, the terror melted away. He wasn't a monster, not a shadow to frighten settlers. He was just a man no older than her dying at her feet. Clara's resolve broke. "Damn it all," she whispered, lowering the rifle. Hauling him inside nearly finished her. He was dead weight, blood muscle and bone dragged inch by inch through the mud until she shoved the door shut behind them. She collapsed by the hearth, trembling arms burning, body spent. She stoked the dying fire until golden light spread through the cabin. For the first time, she saw him clearly, the strong line of his jaw, the scar that slashed across his cheek, the map of old battles etched on his skin. Doubt seized her chest. What kind of man had she dragged across her threshold? Shoving fear aside, she fetched the leather bag Dirk Cutter had left her. With careful hands, she cut away the soaked buckskin. The bullet had passed through a small mercy. The entry wound was clean, but the exit was ragged and brutal. She boiled water washed the torn flesh with carbolic, her own hands stinging. The warrior clenched his jaw, silent, enduring not a cry escaping him. With steady resolve, she packed the wounds, bound his chest with linen torn from her best sheets, and forced bitter willow bark tea between his lips to fight the fever she knew was coming. She pressed the bitter willow bark tea to his lips, forcing him to swallow against the fever she knew was coming. For 2 long days and nights, the storm battered the ridge outside, while a different kind of storm raged inside Clara Boone's cabin. The warrior, whose name she did not yet know, drifted in and out of a burning delirium. His voice, thick with pain, slipped into a language of hard consonants and soft vowels, painting pictures of galloping horses and sudden violence. Clara stayed with him, bathing his brow with cool water, changing blood-soaked dressings, even holding his hand when the tremors shook him too hard. In those endless hours, the world shrank to the rise and fall of a stranger's chest, and her silent prayer that he might cling to life until the next dawn. For a time, he was no longer Apache, and she was no longer a lonely settler. They were just 2 souls adrift, bound by suffering and the fragile hope of survival. When the fever finally broke on the 3rd morning, it was as though the clouds themselves had lifted. His eyes opened, the fever gone fire, steady now. He didn't speak, only watched her move about the cabin, gaze sharp and unsettlingly aware. The silence between them held questions neither had the words to ask. Clara set a bowl of thin broth on a crate beside his cot. "You need to eat," she whispered, though she knew the words meant nothing to him. She mimed lifting a spoon. With effort, he pushed himself upright, a grunt of pain slipping through his teeth. He took the bowl with steady hands and drank. He gave no thanks in words, but his dark eyes met hers and held them, and in that quiet look, she saw acknowledgement. It was enough. The days that followed slipped into a strange rhythm. They spoke only in gestures and sounds. He learned the clatter of her pot meant food. She learned the tilt of his head meant he needed water. The harsh life of a warrior had carved iron into him. By day, she worked her small patch of land, milking her goat, tending vegetables, repairing the fence he had broken in his fall, always aware of the man resting inside. The fear of discovery sat heavy in her stomach. What if Vance Mercer's riders came sniffing around? What if a patrol from Fort Grant rode past? Her mercy could be called treason. At night he would watch her. While she stitched a torn dress or cleaned her Winchester, she felt his eyes follow her movements, not with menace, but with a patient, unnerving curiosity. He studied the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the slump of her shoulders when she thought no one noticed. It was as if he was memorizing her. Soon he was strong enough to stand. He stepped stiffly to the door and looked out across her land, the empty horizon, the lonely cabin, the single horse and goat. His gaze came back to her, and in it was no pity, only respect. He knew what it took to endure out here alone. He began to repay her in quiet ways. One morning she found him sharpening her dullest knife with a smooth river stone. Later he fixed the wobble in her table, carving a perfect wedge to steady its leg. Small things, but each one a gift. Then came the moment that burned itself into her memory. A rattlesnake had coiled near her woodpile, its rattle silent until she reached for a log. Before she even understood the danger he was moving. In 2 strides he seized her arm, yanking her back, and with his free hand hurled a stone so true it crushed the snake's skull. Clara froze, heart pounding, skin crawling with the ghost of the strike that hadn't landed. He still held her arm, grip firm, his nearness overwhelming, the scent of smoke and leather surrounding her. His eyes searched her face, looking for fear. She saw none of the savagery townsfolk whispered about, only fierce protective strength. "Thank you," she breathed, words too small for what he'd done. He only nodded, eyes flicking back to the dead snake, before returning to her. From that brush with death, something new formed between them. He was no longer just a wounded man under her roof. He had become her guardian. That evening he sat by the fire carving a piece of cottonwood with the knife he'd honed. His hands worked for hours, smooth and sure, until he held out a finished piece, a hawk in mid-flight wings spread wide, each feather etched with care. Clara took it, tracing the lines with trembling fingers. It was more than wood. It was his story, his gratitude, and his farewell, all carved into one small bird. And in that instant she knew he would soon be gone. The thought left her hollow. She had grown used to his quiet presence, to the safety it brought. The cabin would feel emptier than ever without it. 3 nights later, she woke with a start. The fire was ash. The blanket folded neat. The cot empty. The hawk sat on her table, wooden eyes fixed on her. Nakai had vanished back into the wilderness as silently as he had come, leaving no trail but the mended table, the sharp knife, and the aching void of his absence. Clara Boone held the carved hawk in her hand, the wood cool and solid against her palm. She had pulled a dying man back from the edge, and in return, he had left behind a piece of himself, a quiet promise carried on the wind. With Nakai gone, the silence of the desert pressed in on her heavier than before. She caught herself listening for the sound of boots that would never cross her floor again, her gaze drifting toward the empty cot by the hearth. Loneliness now cut deeper, for she had known what it felt like, even briefly, to share her world. The hawk became her talisman, a smooth weight in her apron pocket, proof she had not dreamed at all. But life on the ridge didn't grant time for daydreams. Trouble was already circling closer, and it carried the name Vance Mercer. Mercer commanded the sprawling Cimarron Cross Ranch, a kingdom of grass and cattle wrapping around Clara's homestead on 3 sides. He was cut from the same stone as the land itself, hard, ruthless, with pale eyes that saw everything as his to claim. Her small piece of land, blessed with a year-round spring, burned like a thorn in his side. That spring had been the reason Eli Boone had chosen this place, and it was exactly what Mercer wanted, with a greedy hunger. At first he came cloaked in false courtesy. He rode up on a black stallion dressed in silver trappings worth more than her whole farm. "Mrs. Boone?" He rumbled, a false smile tugging at his lips. "A woman alone has no business trying to hold ground like this. Too dangerous. Let me buy you out. Enough to settle you proper in Prescott. Maybe open a shop." Clara had stood in the doorway, Winchester resting loosely but deliberately in her grip. "This is my home, Mr. Mercer. It's not for sale." His smile had tightened. "Everything's for sale. It's just a matter of the right price." When charm failed, his games grew cruel. One morning she found her 2 milk goats with their throats slit, left to rot in the sun. Days later, her fence was torn down, and a dozen of Mercer's longhorns had trampled her vegetable patch into ruin. Driven by fury, Clara rode into Redemption Creek, a sun-bleached town of false-fronted buildings, and stormed straight into Marshal Rourke's office. He was slouched back boots on his desk, polishing his badge with all the energy of a man long past caring. Marshal Clara snapped, her voice shaking with anger. "Mercer's men are destroying my land!" Rourke sighed, without even looking up. "You got proof of that?" "Clara, did you see him do it?" "Who else would it be?" He wants my spring? Mercer's an important man, Rourke said, finally setting his boots down. Pays good taxes, keeps this county alive, says some cattle strayed, says he's sorry. Even offered to pay you for the damage. I don't want his blood money, Clara shot back. I want him to leave me alone. The marshal's voice turned condescending. Now don't get yourself worked up. Mercer's reasonable. Maybe you ought to reconsider. It's a lonely life for a woman out there. Clara left with her jaw tight and her heart boiling in helpless rage. Outside, Jed Coulter Mercer's foreman, Mean, as a snake leaned against the saloon with a pair of ranch hands. His face was a patchwork of sun damage and broken veins, his eyes alive with malice. As she passed, he smirked and spat a dark stream of tobacco into the dust near her feet. The message was clear. Mercer's hand was behind every strike. Weeks later came the cruelest blow. She tasted something foul in her water, rushed to the spring, and found the carcass of a bloated coyote rotting in the pool. The water, her very lifeblood, had been poisoned. It was Mercer's declaration of war. Dragging the carcass out, bucketing the tainted water for 2 days straight, Clara felt eyes on her from the ridges, a glint of light, the sure sign of a spyglass. Mercer wasn't hiding anymore. He was laying siege to her home, starving her out, poisoning her, well confident the law would look the other way. That night, hunched by her hearth, the full weight of her solitude crashed down. The town had turned against her. The law was useless, and the most powerful man in the county was determined to see her broken. She clutched the carved hawk so tightly its edges bit into her palm. Her mind returned to Nakai, the feel of his hand pulling her from the snake, the steady eyes that had watched over her. For a little while, she hadn't been alone. But now, he was gone. Nothing more than a memory. As coyotes howled in the hills, fear colder than the desert night seeped into her bones. Mercer's shadow loomed over everything, and she began to wonder if she would ever see the sun rise free of it again. The seasons turned spring's green, fading to summer's bleached bones. Clara endured her stubbornness, only stoking Mercer's fury. She dug a new well higher up the ridge, back-breaking labor for a trickle of water, but it was hers, and hers alone. Nights were restless, the Winchester at her side, ears straining for every snap of a twig, every whisper of wind. And in town, the redemption settlers spoke in hushed voices, not of stolen cattle now, but of something darker. Rumors spread of a new power rising in the territory. Stories drifted in with weary travelers and jumpy prospectors, whispers of a new Apache war chief who was pulling together the scattered feuding bands under one banner. They said he wasn't some grizzled elder, but a young, ferocious warrior who'd risen from nowhere, striking with a brilliance that outsmarted cavalry patrols and with a ruthlessness that made settlers' blood run cold. Clara Boone first heard the name in Gable's Mercantile. She was trading a few jars of precious peaches for flour when 2 dust-caked prospectors stumbled in, fear etched on their faces. He swept the whole Dragoon Range clean, one muttered voice trembling. Wiped out the railroad survey team. Vanished 'em like smoke. They call him Nakai, the other whispered, as though even speaking it carried danger. They say he moves like a ghost and fights like the devil himself. Clara's hand froze above a sack of beans. The name was unfamiliar, but the description struck deep. They spoke of a man with eyes like black stone scars etched from battles past, moving with the grace of a predator, a warrior who appeared where none expected. As months rolled on, Nakai's legend grew. He became the terror of the territory, and none fumed louder than Vance Mercer. Nakai's growing domain pressed against the northern border of Mercer's Cimarron Cross Ranch, halting the empire builder's steady march. To Mercer, it wasn't just a distant threat. It was a personal insult. "This savage is choking the life out of progress," Mercer thundered one night in the saloon, loud enough for Marshal Rourke to hear every word. Something's got to be done. He started funding his own private army, dangling fat bounties for Apache scalps. Jed Coulter, his brutal foreman, led raids into the hills, bloody reckless strikes that only fueled more reprisals. Violence fed violence, and the land seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the firestorm. Clara felt trapped in the middle. Hatred toward every native had reached a fever pitch. Her one act of mercy now felt like a rope around her neck. She stayed clear of town, but on one desperate trip for supplies, Jed Coulter and 2 of Mercer's men blocked her path. "Heard you keep to yourself out there? Widow Boone?" Coulter sneered whiskey sour on his breath. "Not much company, is it?" "That's the way I like it," Clara answered evenly. "Funny thing," he drawled, stepping closer. "Some of the boys said they tracked a wounded buck a while back. Trail led right near your land before the storm washed it clean. They were sure Nakai's devils were close." His eyes narrowed. "You wouldn't know anything about Harbor and Vermin, would you?" Clara's blood ran cold. They had been the ones who'd shot him. The memory of dragging that broken warrior into her cabin flashed hot and sharp. The attack hadn't been random. It was part of Mercer's bloody crusade to clear her out. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her hand instinctively brushing the pocket where she kept the carved hawk. Coulter's sneer turned meaner. "Best be careful, Mrs. Boone. These days, if you ain't with us, you're against us. And Mr. Mercer don't take kindly to those against him." He finally stepped aside, but the threat clung to her long after he was gone. Clara hurried home, her thoughts racing. The man she had saved, the silent warrior who sharpened her knife and pulled her from the snake, wasn't just any Apache. He was Nakai. The timing, the scars, the fire in his eyes, it all fit. The truth chilled her. She was bound now in secret to the most feared man in the territory. Her lonely homestead, once a refuge, had become the eye of a gathering storm, and she knew bone deep that storm was about to break. It came on a moonless night. The air hung heavy silence, thick with menace. Clara had felt it building for days, every instinct screaming Mercer's patience had run out. She barred her door, Winchester across her lap, listening. The first warning wasn't a sound, but a smell, smoke, acrid and oily. Her heart slammed in her chest. The barn. She threw open the door. Flames clawed skyward, devouring the small barn that sheltered Storm and her goats. Their terrified screams tore through her like a blade. Jed Coulter and 4 riders from the Samaran Cross stood against the blaze, their faces twisted and monstrous in the firelight, laughter curling into the night. "Time's up," Widow Coulter roared, his voice dripping with malice. "Mr. Mercer made you a final offer." Rage, pure and burning, shoved aside her fear. Clara raised the Winchester, fired a shot that cracked the night wide open. The bullet struck dirt near a rider's horse, making it rear in panic. Startled, the men fired back. Bullets ripped into the log walls of her cabin, splinters flying near her head. Clara ducked inside, her heart hammering. This was it. They hadn't come to scare her. They had come to finish her. They hadn't come to frighten her anymore. They'd come to burn her out or bury her. The cries of her animals inside the barn ended in the merciless crack of gunfire. Hot tears of rage blurred Clara Boone's vision. "Come on out, little lady Jed." Coulter's voice carried through the smoke, dripping with mockery. Clara shoved shells into the Winchester with shaking hands, fury steadying what fear could not. If this was her last night, she'd meet it on her feet, defending her land, not cowering in the dark. She drew a breath to storm the door when a new sound split the night. It began as a low, haunting cry from the ridges, something between a wolf's howl and the raw cry of vengeance. Another answered, then another, until the desert rang with the blood-chilling ululations of Apache war cries. The laughter of Coulter's men died in their throats. They wheeled in their saddles, peering into the blackness beyond the firelight. The night itself seemed to come alive. An arrow, dark-feathered and silent, hissed from the shadows and struck a rider through the throat. He toppled from the saddle with a choking gurgle, blood spraying the dust. Panic erupted. Horses reared riders fired blindly into the dark. From the rocks and brush came figures, warriors on foot, swift as spirits, their faces painted for war. They struck with knives and tomahawks, pulling men from their saddles with terrifying speed. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Jed Coulter, pale as death, yanked his reins to flee, only to find a rider barring his path. Out of the smoke surged a pinto warhorse, carrying a man taller than the rest. No paint marked his skin, only a lattice of scars gleaming in the firelight. His stillness radiated command, his very presence bending the air around him. Clara's breath caught. Even from her doorway she knew him, the shoulders, the way he sat a horse. The power coiled in silence. Nakai. With casual precision, Nakai drove his war lance, striking Coulter and sending him crashing into the dust. The foreman's reign of cruelty ended where it had begun, on the soil he had poisoned with Mercer's will. The slaughter ended as quickly as it had begun. The night returned to silence, broken only by the crackle of the barn collapsing in flame. Nakai dismounted his warriors, melting back into the shadows. He strode toward the cabin moccasins, soundless on hard-packed earth. This was not the fevered man she had once dragged from the mud. This was the war chief of whispered legend, a man who carried life and death in his hands. He was magnificent, fearsome, untouchable. An older warrior stepped beside him. Tawa, face lined with years, eyes sharp as flint. His English was clipped thick with accent. He says the debt is not forgotten. Tawa translated his gaze, shifting between Nakai and Clara. Clara gripped the Winchester tighter, words trapped in her throat. You saved his life, Tawa continued. A life for a life. That is our way. But your life here is finished. Mercer will send more men. An army. You cannot survive alone. Nakai stepped closer, his dark eyes locking on hers, burning with that same intensity she remembered. Tawa's voice cut the silence. He is Nakai, chief of the people. He has not only come to save you, he has come to claim you. You will be his wife. That is the payment. The words hung in the smoke, heavier than the carnage. Not a question, not a request. A decree delivered with the certainty of a king. Dawn's first light bled across the ridges, painting smoke and sky in gray and rose. The barn was a smoldering scar, a pyre for the life Clara had known. The bodies of Coulter and his men were already gone, vanished with the night, leaving only dark stains in the dirt to prove it had happened. She faced Nakai, the space between them alive with impossible tension. His warriors lingered like shadows, a jury of silence. Tawa stood ready at his side. Wife? Clara finally whispered the word foreign and unreal. That's not... You can't just... Tawa listened, then spoke again after conferring with Nakai. He does not take what is not his. Mercer's men shot him because they wanted this land this spring, the same men who would have killed you tonight. His fight and your fight are one. He owes you his life. A life is repaid with life. By making you his wife, he places you under his protection. It is honor. Honor. To him, maybe. To Clara, it sounded like a cage. She looked at the ashes of her home, at the wide, merciless horizon. What was she holding on to? a patch of earth every man seemed hell-bent to take from her. A life in solitude and fear. I can't. Clara Boone shook her head, the words torn from her lips before she could stop them. My world is here. I'm not one of your people. Nakai spoke, then his voice low, resonant, a sound that seemed to bypass the need for translation, striking straight into her chest. A heartbeat later, Tawa gave the English, Your world wants you dead. Vance Mercer killed your animals, poisoned your spring. He sent these men to burn you out. The lawman in town wears Mercer's leash. Stay here, and by sunset you'll be dead. They will say it was an Apache raid, and Mercer will finally own your land. Every word rang with truth. Clara's own world had turned its back, offering her nothing but a shallow grave. This fierce chief was offering her life, but at a cost that stripped her of everything she had been. What kind of life would that be? She whispered, trembling. A prisoner in your camp. Nakai's gaze softened for the barest instant before he answered. His words rolled like thunder, Tawa carrying them into English. He says, You were not his prisoner when he lay helpless in your cabin. You will not be his prisoner in his camp. You will be the wife of the chief. You will be respected. You will be safe. Safe. The word rang hollow. Would she ever know safety again? Clara thought of the long nights with her Winchester at her side, the sneer in Jed Coulter's eyes, the endless fear. And then she thought of Nakai, how he had sharpened her knife, pulled her back from the snake, watched her with that quiet, steady presence. A killer, yes, but one who had shown her more protection than anyone else in this ruthless land. He does not force you, Tawa added, voice edged with finality. The sun is rising. Mercer will have heard the guns. His men are gathering. They will come. Stay and you will die. Ride with us now and you live. The choice is yours. Nakai extended his hand. It was not a plea, not even a demand, but an open invitation. To take it meant leaving behind Clara Boone, widow of Blackwood Ridge. To refuse meant death. She stared at that hand, strong, calloused, the same hand that had carved the hawk she carried in her apron. Then she lifted her eyes to his face. His dark gaze was unyielding, carved with certainty ancient as the desert. He was no storybook savior. He was a force of nature as wild and unforgiving as the land itself. But he was her only hope. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The ghosts of Eli Boone and Dr. Cutter whispered warnings, but survival roared louder. Smoke and morning dew filled her lungs as the first light crowned the mountains. The sun spilled across Nakai's face. A new day, the edge of a new life or the end of one. When her decision came, it was not surrender, but quiet, resolute acceptance. Clara looked from Nakai's outstretched hand to the smoldering ruin of her barn, the barn she and Eli had built the town of Redemption Creek that had judged and abandoned her. There was nothing left but the cold promise of a grave. Her hands, scarred from labor, trembled. They were the hands of a survivor, but survival was no longer about clinging to a patch of dirt. It was about letting go. Slowly, as if wading through deep water, she raised her hand and placed it in his. His skin was warm, rough, his grip firm, not the possessive hold of a captor, but the steady anchor of a man bracing her against a storm. A pact was sealed in that simple touch, witnessed only by the burning ruins and the silent warriors standing guard in the shadows. Nakai gave the barest nod, a flicker of emotion crossing his scarred face, before the mask of command returned. He barked sharp words in his tongue, and at once his men moved. 2 warriors, Chenoa and Dakota, strode toward the lean-to, which miraculously still stood. They saddled Storm with efficient precision, the movements of men who had handled countless horses. "You may take what you can carry," Tawa translated. "We ride in minutes." Clara stepped back into her cabin, crossing the threshold as if crossing into another life. The small room felt foreign now, like a museum of a past already gone. Her eyes roamed the familiar things, the pots, the blankets, the worn table. What do you take when leaving your world behind? Not the heavy tools, not the comforts of a homestead. Those belonged to a life she no longer had. Her hand brushed across the table Nakai had once mended, a silent marker of their first bond. She went to the small wooden chest at the foot of her bed. From it, she drew a worn, leather-bound book of poetry her mother had once cherished. Its pages filled with gentle verses about gardens and seas, far away worlds, softer than this brutal frontier. It was a keepsake of a gentler time. Beside it lay a silver-backed daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. She studied their hopeful young faces, whispering a quiet apology, begging forgiveness for the path she was about to take. Finally, her gaze turned to the rough mantel above the hearth. The carved hawk waited there, silent and watchful. For a heartbeat, she thought of taking it, but she knew it belonged to this place. Nakai had left it as a marker, a seal on the first chapter of their story. Leaving it behind felt right closing the circle. Instead, she took Eli Boone's simple gold wedding band from the dish beside it. It no longer fit her work-hardened fingers, but she closed her fist around it, the metal cool and solid. It wasn't a rejection of the life ahead, but a promise to herself she would not forget the woman she had been. When Clara stepped back into the brightening morning, Storm was ready reins in the hands of Chenoa. Beside the horse stood Nakai's fierce pinto mane, braided with a single feather-faded paint, still clinging to its flanks. His warriors were mounted already, a company of ghosts come to life, their eyes sharp, missing nothing. Clara felt suddenly clumsy, pale, and out of place in their stark world. Nakai swung onto his warhorse in one smooth motion and looked down at her. His eyes asked a silent question, no mockery, no impatience, just a calm measure of her resolve. Drawing a breath, Clara set her foot in Storm's stirrup and swung into the saddle. The worn leather was a familiar comfort in the storm of her new reality. Just as she gathered her reins, a low thunder of hooves rolled across the hard earth. Dust rose on the horizon, Mercer's posse. At least 15 riders stormed toward her land. At the head rode Vance Mercer rifle, resting easy across his saddle, and beside him the slighter frame of Marshal Rourke. They rode with the certainty of men convinced they would find a widow's corpse and claim a spring. A bitter smile ghosted across Clara's lips. They were too late. Nakai saw them, showing neither surprise nor alarm. He simply raised his hand, palm out. No grand gesture, but his warriors shifted instantly, spreading into a crescent before him. Bows bent arrows, notched lances set. Their discipline was quiet and absolute, a wall of death between their chief and the riders. The posse stumbled, reining raggedly to a halt 100 yards away. Their bold charge crumbled into hesitation. Clara watched their faces shift from confidence to confusion, to the gnawing fear of men realizing they were outmatched. They had expected a lone dead woman. Instead, they faced the blood-soaked legend of the territory and his warriors. Mercer bellowed across the distance, his voice thin with rage. "What's the meaning of this? Are you a traitor?" Nakai and his men did not answer. They sat silent on their horses, contempt heavier than any threat. Nakai's eyes locked on Mercer's, stripping the rancher of all his bluster and arrogance. In that charged silence, a boundary was carved not with paper or ink, but with the promise of blood. This land, and the woman who had bled for it, were under his protection now. At last, Nakai turned his horse, the gesture final and dismissive. He nudged the pinto into a steady trot. With a sharp command, his warriors fell in line, and they rode north toward the mountains, leaving Mercer's men swallowed in dust and silence. Clara guided Storm beside him. She did not look back. Behind her lay smoke, ashes, and the impotent fury of smaller men. Ahead was only the unknown. The sun climbed higher, warming her face, as the land shifted desert scrub, giving way to the resinous scent of pines. She rode beside the silent chief, their horses moving in rhythm. He had not spoken to her, not once. But in the face of Mercer's posse, he had stood before her, not behind. That was everything. Questions gnawed at her. What would she eat? Where would she sleep? How would the women of his tribe receive her? The knot of fear in her gut was real, but beneath it burned the stubborn fire that had kept her alive on Blackwood Ridge. She would learn to survive this, too. Glancing at Nakai's unyielding profile, she felt a strange calm settle over her. He was violence and protection bound into one man, a savage, yes, but one with honor. She had stepped out of her world and into his legend. This was no fairy tale from a book of verse. It was the start of the hardest chapter of her life. But for the first time in 3 long years, Clara Boone wasn't riding alone. And under the wide, merciless sky of the West, she knew she would follow this trail wherever it led. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West, stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you.